$3 million sounds like a lot of money, and for the average American, it absolutely is. But physicians kind of come with their own unique set of circumstances that warrant some additional financial planning. Think higher incomes, maybe a later start, probably some higher spending, and likely some unique tax considerations. For the average individual Googling how much do I need to retire, the answer maybe could be slightly similar to how much would a physician need to retire, albeit with some unique considerations or circumstances. For starters, that search is likely going to yield a few different things. First and foremost is what's called the 4% rule. Just the general idea that in retirement, if you're living off of a portfolio of investments, basically, you can withdraw 4% of the value of that portfolio in a given year to more or less sustain the value of the portfolio over time. It is not an end-all be-all answer to retirement, more or less kind of like a back-of-the-napkin answer or approach to thinking about retirement, roughly estimating how much money in investments you might need in order to finally retire. Another important consideration that will likely come up in some sort of introductory search is something around Social Security. For most doctors today, that answer is probably going to vary pretty widely, depending on how long you've been working, what your earnings have been in those years. So that's why it's important to, as part of kind of an overall financial plan, just be aware of, if I start taking Social Security at various ages, what are those numbers going to look like? And really just making sure that the numbers are correct prior to actually retiring so you kind of know what you're getting into. And so while it's important to have kind of a handle on what these income values might look like or what kind of portfolio assets are that you could generate or create income from, it's also, if not more important, to have a handle on kind of the three big expenditure categories. What is my kind of discretionary expense amount? What are my taxes going to look like in retirement? And what, if any, healthcare costs am I going to incur throughout my retirement? As you might imagine, expenses for a physician household can vary quite widely between how much income the household has generated during those working years, kind of what your lifestyle expectations are, and most importantly, kind of what you're comfortable budgeting for over a long period of time. I see kind of a full range among the clients and households I work with. I see those anywhere between $150,000 and $300,000 a year. It can, again, be very different depending on kind of what household income looks like relative to necessary and fixed costs, but I think that's kind of a general ballpark that I typically see. And I think one of the things that a lot of physicians or just doctors in general don't really think about as they're heading into retirement is that even if you gauge what your average expenses look like over the last 5 to 10 years, kind of come up with a number that might make sense for your household, it's not uncommon for those first few years of retirement to actually see higher expense amounts, likely as you're traveling more or taking up new hobbies or just kind of catching up on a lot of the things that you had put off. That increased expense amount coupled with inflation and just factoring in how costs will go up, whether it's going to the gym or taking a trip, expenses will rise more than likely. And so it's important to factor that in as you're kind of going through that analysis. Again, where having a financial plan in place can be really helpful. To help break that down or just to visualize what expenditure amounts might look like for kind of the households that we are talking about, I have an example here. This is definitely on the higher side. I think of things for a household making $500,000 a year. In this example, it's a urologist and their spouse. We'll get into another illustration here in a second with a little more detail on some projections and things like that of how does spending impact their retirement and all the sorts of things. But more or less, for simplicity's sake, I've put together just a completely fictitious budget for a household with $500,000 in gross income. They live in California, so taxes might be higher, but tax amounts are looking at around $151,000. Are there ways to bring that down? Likely through some sort of retirement plan contributions if they own their practice versus as a W-2. Doctor, as a hospitalist, that's going to vary slightly and opportunities there. So really net take home comes out to around $350,000. And so monthly net is around $30,000 in total. And this is, again, just completely fictitious and made up, but I think probably not uncommon for, especially on the West Coast, for a household that's, spending upwards of almost $85,000 a year on housing costs, mortgage, taxes, insurance, all that good stuff. Certainly you can see that with higher incomes very often come just higher expenses as well. And I think it's important to keep these kind of ideas in mind. Sometimes it's helpful to look back over 5 years to say what's kind of my average look like. If I'm supporting family members, if I have kids in college or what have you, as they kind of age out or age off the payroll, if you will, how then does that impact me, over the long term? And so I think just kind of visualizing things like this can be helpful. There's no question that reviewing personal expenses is a really important and critical part of this whole process. I think also in just planning for retirement for a lot of doctors is taking a look at their tax picture currently as it stands overall. What things could they be doing to be more tax efficient now? But then also viewing if I have 5 years till retirement or 10 years or what have you, and even into retirement, what things can I be doing today to mitigate taxes over the long term? Not just what should I be doing, what small deduction or what have you could I take today to reduce my taxes? What are some things I could be doing right now to set myself up foundationally for over the next 30 plus years in retirement to have a lower tax bill net over that 30-year time frame? For a lot of doctors and their spouses, one of the common hiccups, I guess I often see them running into, and it's common for high incomers in general, but I think doctors are particularly susceptible, is just having a high concentration of assets in pre-tax accounts. So maybe you have a pre-tax 403b, a pre-tax 401k, more or less lots of assets that you own that you have not yet paid taxes on. And the hiccup or challenge I see coming from that is someone might look at those balances and see a balance of hypothetically $3 million or more and say, okay, I'm set. I have $3, $4, $5 million saved and ready for retirement. I'm good to go. And the answer is, while that is absolutely an incredible achievement, one very important consideration as it pertains to tax planning is just that you haven't paid the taxes on those assets yet. And so that idea or concept has to be factored in as you're making withdrawals from those portfolios in retirement. Two important things jump out for that. Number one is just that $1 million IRA is technically not really $1 million. It's probably more like $700,000 after you factor in state, local, and federal taxes in withdrawing those assets. Hand in hand with that is also just that if you have such a large balance in pre-tax accounts, interestingly, it can make sense to start to withdraw higher balances than maybe you even need earlier on in retirement to keep yourself within a certain tax bracket. And in tandem with that, getting more assets out of those pre-tax accounts to ideally reduce the balance of them, to reduce required minimum distributions later on into your 70s. Especially doctors retire with really large concentrations in pre-tax accounts. They get into their 70s, into their 80s, and their required minimum distributions become so large that it could sometimes be 2 times the amount of money they need to actually live on. They're forced to withdraw out of those portfolios. They're forced to pay taxes on that income, on that full amount of that distribution, and it pushes them into higher tax brackets, potentially closer to even where they were while they were working. And so the question, or just the idea to all of this, is just to say, what things can we be doing today to offset or reduce that tax bill in the present day? But especially, what is like a longer term strategy we can implement to save ourselves on taxes over the long term? Sometimes that might be a Roth IRA conversion early on in retirement, especially for retiring younger, looking at what is a dollar value we can move from an IRA into a Roth IRA to pay taxes today, but save ourselves a significant amount of taxes over the long term. In tandem with that is just looking at our assets in general, some spread or mix of taxable accounts, we're paying taxes on them each year. Maybe we have some sort of Roth accounts that we might have, a mix over all of our retirement assets, and the pre-tax accounts as well. How do we use all of those various assets in tandem together? Even with a health savings account, for example, how do we use all of those assets in tandem together to create a tax efficient stream of income in retirement? It's that planning and that methodology I think is so critically important as you're entering retirement and looking at, do I actually have enough to retire on? And can we kind of run scenarios or projections to see if that dollar value is in fact going to meet whatever your needs are in retirement? Here in a second, I'm going to pull up an actual financial plan for a hypothetical client of how all of this works together. Before I do that, the last point I really want to touch on as it pertains to retirement that I think it trips up a lot of doctors, surprisingly those working in healthcare, is just how costly healthcare can be in retirement, especially if you are one who is retiring before the age of 65, when Medicare kicks in. Medicare is surprisingly not free, especially typically for doctors who've built up a decent balance of assets. And so if you're retiring before Medicare even kicks in, your healthcare costs are going to be especially high, probably compared to, especially if you've been working, when you see that you'll be paying $20,000 to $30,000 a year for healthcare costs. And that's just for the premiums alone. And so that's such a critical element of this whole process. What am I doing to cover myself during this healthcare desert before the age of 65, where costs are very high? What things am I doing today in my late 40s and my 50s to prepare myself for that, to where if I am 60 and I do have what I need to retire, what am I doing to offset or negate or mitigate at least a lot of those costs? Health savings accounts, for example, can be a great strategy to implement over 10, 20 years to kind of prepare oneself and your family to cover just those really, really high costs. As you've probably surmised by watching this video so far, the realities of planning for a physician household to retire is maybe a little more complex than just the very simple 4% rule answer or when do I need to take Social Security? Albeit very important questions to answer, don't get me wrong. There's typically, I just find, especially when there's a lot of dollars involved, maybe just a little more analysis that is typically warranted for this consideration or decision. So one of the things that I think is helpful is just to build more or less a financial plan, to visualize and potentially run projections around how am I doing presently as it pertains to planning for retirement, as my overall investment mix, does it line up with my objective of whenever I want to retire? What changes should I be doing, or what strategies am I missing out on? And ultimately, just providing some guidance as to, am I on the right path? What things could I be doing better? What things could I just be doing in general? So one of the things I think is helpful to look at is this is Joe and Jill's sample. They are a completely fictitious client. Joe is a urologist, back to the prior example that we just showed, and this is a breakdown of just their assets and their net worth overall, almost around $4 million in net worth. Most of that is home ownership and a vacation home. Invested assets of around $3 million, and you can see it that Joe and Jill, Joe is a urologist and Jill is a nurse that works part-time. You can see it's a breakdown of lots of different retirement accounts all over the place, which is honestly not uncommon during your working years. Not a lot of thought probably to consolidating or making sure that everything is aligned properly with what we want it to do, which is completely okay. But a big takeaway here is it's very hard if you don't have a visual of this to understand, like if I make a change here or there, how then does that impact my broader financial plan? And really, how am I invested across all of my accounts? What's going to make sense from a drawdown perspective, again, to be tax efficient in all of this? And even with 5 years left until retirement, what final things could I really be doing to prepare myself for retirement? Is $3 million enough to retire? So this is a great, I think, illustration of that. I'll very quickly run through just the facts for Joe and Jill, just so you, all of our viewers, have a breakdown. Joe is currently 55, Jill is 51. We have the retirement ages currently at 65. We'll switch that up, run some various things here. We always run projections out to age 100, just because we hope and expect clients to live long and fruitful lives. And then lastly, 3 kids down here at the bottom, 2 of which are in school, 2 are twins. There's always some fun considerations around that. Again, a good breakdown of overall assets and net worth, whether it's cars, vacation home, have a mortgage, all these types of things, all just factored in. What we don't see running in the background are our projections on overall returns for those portfolios, the tax implications of those various assets, how much is being contributed to those. We'll look here in a second. For income for Joe, we currently have around $450,000. It's like a base earnings plus a potential $50,000 bonus up through retirement. Jill was working part-time, but still with a decent income of around $75,000 in benefits, which is always nice. And then down here at the bottom, we just built out, the system basically builds out a projection of what Social Security might look like. For actual clients who are going through this process, we really like to get a pull statement from the Social Security Administration, just so we know exactly what the dollar values are and we can populate those into the plan. And for, I think, one of the big questions that we've alluded to that you've probably caught on to is just expenses and taxes and really healthcare costs are so critical to dial in as we work through an analysis on all of this. Here we see that Joe and Jill are currently spending in just pure discretionary dollars around $150,000 a year. We expect for that to continue in retirement, and importantly, inflation's running in the background here. So $150,000 today is probably going to be $153,000 or $4,000 next year as that 3% inflation creeps up on us. We have their mortgage payments down here. Again, running in the background, as we saw, were just liabilities, college costs and educational costs, a nice wedding trip coming up for a 30th anniversary, several disability and long-term care policies, life insurance policies, and then we're factoring in federal and state taxes. Certainly California warrants some additional consideration, just a higher tax state. And then contributions and savings. Joe and Jill are still putting away money into 529 plans. From a tax perspective, at the state level, that can be beneficial. in, maybe not in California, but in general beneficial. And so then we also have 403B and 401k contributions for Joe and Jill, all great things. I think one of the things we're always looking at though is, could we be doing better? Are there changes warranted throughout all of this? So the question very simply is, can we retire on $3 million? And the system is basically able to run a series of projections around, if we go with this expense amount versus that expense amount, how does that impact us over the long term on $3 million? If we put away more money, so we retire with $5 million, how does that impact us based on spending $150,000 versus $200,000 a year? If our Social Security increases or decreases, or inflation increases or decreases, the parameters, as you could start to imagine, are nearly infinite. And so I think that's just the benefit of having a plan like this. We can kind of run various things. Life does not happen on a linear track and does not increase linearly. And so I think it's important to just be ready for all the curveballs that life throws at us and kind of the changes that are warranted. One of the things we always like to see when we're building a plan is what's called a lifetime portfolio value, which is more or less just the balance of your invested assets in the present day and really kind of what we project them to be over time. It's always nice to see that, absent of any changes, that our current goals or objectives, retiring at 65 for each of them, we see a nice upward trend of assets to the right, basically meaning that our portfolio is growing faster than we can spend it down. We also like to see a flat bar here, which also is indicative of our portfolio is maintaining our spend over time. I'll also add for some clients, it's very critical that this value be near zero when they pass away or when they die. And so certainly we can work around that as well. The question though is $3 million sustainable? And I think one of the easiest ways to look at that is just an overview of cash flow without absent any changes. And we see that, again, without really much change, the red line up here at the top is met by portfolio assets, withdrawals from them over time. We'll see while Joe and Jill are still working here up till 65, when Joe retires in 2035, that light blue line is able to meet their expense needs, his and hers expense needs. And then when Jill retires 5 years later, you can kind of see some of her blue lines there. Her $75,000 a year starts to be replaced by a combination of portfolio withdrawals here in the orange and Social Security income here in the dark purple. The big thing I will note, especially down here, is the tax bomb I mentioned earlier in the video is when we start to see these RMD values, these dark burnt orange lines, start to really, really tick up, almost to where there's so much money in expenses, when the reality is we're just taking huge RMDs, in this instance, $350,000 taken out of the account. Are they spending that much? Probably not. A lot of it's probably just being reinvested or saved or gifted away to kids or charities or what have you. But there are some things some strategies or ideas or concepts that we can run here in these early retirement years where our tax bracket is lower. And that can then help us to offset or mitigate some of those higher costs later on. And one of the things people not necessarily overlook, but just don't really think about, is that in retirement, especially in the early years, the tax bracket that you are in, you are more or less able to control it unlike any other year that you could in the past. So any pre-tax account withdrawals is going to contribute against that. But if we're doing conversions in these lower bracket years and keeping it down in these kind of lower brackets as opposed to what we were paying in these higher brackets, then there's certainly tax benefit to be had there. So the overarching question of, can they retire at 65 and then Jill 5 years later at 65? The answer is probably yes. We saw earlier, we run what's called a Monte Carlo simulation to say, based on all a potential 1,000 market simulations with all the factors and analysis that we just inputted, what is the probability that we would need to change our lifestyle materially? In this instance, it's about a 7% chance, which is more or less like a nothing chance or a very, very low chance. But one of the things, though, we'd like to look at is then, well, if 65 works, then what does a lower age work? Or if we both retire, let's say, aged 5 years apart, if we both want to retire in 2032, Joe is 62, Jill is 57, how then does that impact us over the long term? We can see that it's slightly dipped in probability of success, but even still, there's probably things we could be doing today. Contributing to and investing in HSA likely has benefit. I think just additional questions around if we start to increase living expenses, and if we retire at 62, we've got a 3-year gap until Joe can start on Medicare, and so that probably additional $25,000 in expense baked in here. And we can see that certainly the probability dips to, 62 is certainly lower. It's probably around a 40% chance of some sort of change needed at some point down the line. But this is not like an A, B, C, or a D like you might remember in grade school or college or what have you. It's actually far from it. It's really just an indicator and a barometer of, are we headed in the right direction? And is there the potential for change down the line? Most people, again, do not spend in a linear fashion. This is running a linear projection. And so that's an important element of all of this to factor in as well. Short answer, can $3 million work? Probably yes, in this instance. I think the reality or the key takeaway is just that everyone's financial situation is so completely different. I say this to clients that are physician households all the time. You could be working in the same role as a colleague, another attending physician for 25 years, make the same exact amount of money, but you inherited $2 million when you turned 40. Whereas they had $500,000 in student loan debt, or vice versa. Everyone's financial situation is so completely different, even though it might seem very similar, that it just warrants very specific analysis to get optimal or ideal outcomes that align with goals and objectives that we might have. As one could probably see, there's maybe a little more analysis to all of this than one might initially think. And I think that's just the key takeaway from this entire video and just the concept of retirement, especially as it pertains to doctors. It's just that, similar to a patient case, what might seem very apparent or obvious, there might be underlying issues that are just not apparent. More thoughtful, careful analysis can be very impactful in giving us better guidance and ultimately a better path forward as it pertains to managing our finances and ultimately planning for a successful retirement that aligns our goals with our finances. Can you retire on $3 million as a doctor? Probably. It all just depends, again, on what your situation is. And what could be $3 million could be a wildly successful plan for one physician household, could be an abject failure for another doctor's household. And so that's the consideration I would really encourage you to think through. What types of things should I be thinking about as it pertains to retirement that's upcoming? What things could I be doing earlier on in my career to prepare me for the kind of retirement that I want on my terms? And lastly, what things am I missing out on that I could be taking advantage of to move the needle on making retirement maybe more flexible, earlier, or really more on the terms that I want it to be? Thank you for watching and for tuning in. I'm Scott Sturgeon. I'm a CFP and the founder and senior wealth advisor of Oriad Wealth Partners. We're a fee-only fiduciary financial planning and wealth management firm working primarily with physicians and business owners, planning around retirement and really helping to align their finances with what's important in their lives. If any of this has resounded with you, there's a link below in the description where you can do a free assessment, more or less, to see if working together might be a great fit and to kind of help gauge or at least give some guidance or thoughts on how things are working for you in readiness for retirement and hopefully to provide a path forward for you over time. As always, thanks again for tuning in. Have a great rest of your day.